The reason that we've organized this symposium into tracks is because we think that these are some of the most interesting themes driving kind of open technology research. And one of the reasons we wanted to do the theme Open Technology Impact in Uncertain Times is really this kind of key theme of open technologies and their relationship to geopolitics. And that's what we've tried to unpack from different angles this morning. I want to give you all a chance to ask some more questions because we haven't had as much time for questions as we wanted this morning. We'll fix that in the afternoon. But what I really want to seize on is kind of one of the key themes as a way to start our conversation. So many of you have noted the gap between kind of the global and the local. So you've talked about kind of the role of different actors in shaping paradigms at the global, national, and local level. But you've also talked about kind of the global level theorization overall and kind of the need for local level implementation of kind of globally standardized or normalized processes, whether in DPI governance, standardization, or national digitalization. So in terms of that kind of theoretic of national, local, global, what do you see as some of the key barriers or enablers in kind of translating these frameworks into meaningful local action? Does anyone want to start first?
So my presentation and my work is far more focused at like the global regional level, but I wanted to note in response to Nick's great question that there is also this phenomenon of globalization. Like how can you try and bridge the gap between the two and develop solutions that directly address and engage the local community's needs? In the process of starting a new paper at the moment on procurement policies being implemented in municipalities in an EU member state. And that paper came about because my co-authors, they were being asked by these members of local councils, like, how can we actually implement open source solutions? Especially as like our national government is saying that this is a key policy priority because of like digital sovereignty, a desire for resilience, autonomy, etc. And so I think it's really important that research like that is continuing, that we think about what is needed at the grassroots and how can we address it, including some of Cassie's fantastic research.
Yeah, Marco? There's a button. You have to hold it down longer.
Okay. Well, one point that for me is to be highlighted is that for what I observed in our research, is that one of the main driver of the adoption of open technology is the willing to shape global standard. This is a very key element that you observe in this moment, and I think this is unavoidable to a certain extent. Now, if the future of technology is about shaping huge critical mass adopters and developers of your technological path, now this is the game. Then also, I would say that another emerging trend is about and RISC-V is an interesting case, allowing in this direction customization of global standards. This is another, I would say, unavoidable trend because it's so strong, the need to preserve security and autonomy, that this is another trend that you see quite clearly, no? So in that sense, we can observe localized versions of common standards.
Jan, did you want to come in on that point of standardization?
Yes, and I think I'm super happy to talk about Marco because he's really someone that inspired me a lot for my work as well. And I think building on some of the things that you also wrote, I think it's really a paradigmatic shift that is happening in how through open technologies power is organized. And I think states know how to navigate legal regimes of power. That's what states usually do. States have learned how to navigate economic market-based forms of power and how this works. And I think, and this is why I think the Commons framework is quite useful to me, and open technologies are built on something else. And I think build on something that is enabling people, providing agency in a different way to develop their own values and create collective action based on this in frameworks that are intertwined and entangled with legal regimes, with market-based regimes, but still like completely redistribute power in a different way. And I think that they, to some extent, I think they question this idea of global versus local solutions because they can transcend this and are not necessarily bounded into national geography. So I think it's a bit of a question how different actors, academics, corporate actors, states learn how to navigate this form of collective action and also instrumentalize it and use it for their own needs. And I think it's really a newer arena of power, which I think make RISC-V example interesting is that you see that like this is a new place where key decisions are being made, where negotiations are taking place, that it's a bit outside of the traditional arenas of geopolitics.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Cassie, Raphael, Ramya, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I would just like to point out very quickly. I'm sorry, Casey, if I took the this initiative that's funded by the European Commission. That's called Open Source Ecosystem Enabler. That you have in Kenya, in Trinidad, but now like they received so many more applications than they expected. So they're trying to get other sources of funding for it. So it's surprisingly successful. So it means it really resonates. So it means like setting up OSPOs in countries, in partner countries. So it also seems to speak to the fact that it's not just power politics under the guise of open source development, like these, these strategic narratives that are being deployed, we know, by India and now the EU and others. So there's also a more positive look that we can have at this with OSPOs across the world.
Many people had made great comments about geopolitical aspect. So I want to bring to one aspect which I was having hard time reconciliating while I was researching, which was not necessarily the open source word, as in I classified it as makers, which include like maintainers, contributors, and the community in the open source, and sort of the users. And then looked at like kind of macro level, like open source word was like anarchistic, like as in, and I know that this term is conflated and used wrongly a lot, as in thinking it's chaotic, and I mean anarchistic as in self-governing. Like, and then at some point corporations started taking interest in open source, and then after governments now we see started taking interest in this. And then I started thinking like from Nick's wonderful question, with that, like where is local and where is global as well? And then, yeah, and then it's like, okay, that's probably the global versus local at the users of that. So probably also so probably also important to think about the makers of maker.
Turn it back on again.
Makers of the community, open source community itself, as well as like who is taking advantage or who is making use of this when we think about global versus local.
What's really interesting for me is if we think of the global as a list of like approaches or principles. For instance, there's global consensus around integrating open source into digital public infrastructures. It's then really interesting to see how this manifests in terms of national motivations for how these principles are interpreted and how they are actioned. So if we think of, for example, open protocols for digital payments, the ways in which this is operationalized in India via a non-profit company which manages these protocols, but can also build its own payments application to compete with other actors, versus in Brazil, where it's the central bank that's managing these protocols and effectively like kind of taking a more classical regulatory function on the market of payment providers. Is really interesting here for me to see then how these global principles or approaches become operationalized at national levels because of differing national motivations. On the flip side, then it's also interesting for me to see how local initiatives become institutionalized in that sense, become absorbed into national policies and national discourse. So the Silo example, for instance, in Brazil, a publication platform that originated in Brazil, but has since become a trans-South American publishing venue. It's impacting, it's serving as an evidence base for policy making across South America, for instance, is really interesting in the ways then in which a very small, localized publishing platform managed to become networked and then managed to transcend upwards. So for me, these two movements in terms of how the global becomes national and then how the local goes upwards to become national is really interesting.
And then also how like the different actors are intersecting with all of those different levels at any given time. I found your research really instructive in that regard, Marco. So yeah, I think we see all of these competing forces intersecting at all these different levels, and we see open technology as kind of a really unique use case for geopolitical competition and state power. I did want to open it up to the rest of you all to see if you had any questions either relating to that kind of theme or on anything else that we've been talking about for the last few hours. Yeah.
Very exciting section, panel, morning, I suppose. So questions for anyone, but Jan, this was stemmed by what you were talking about. I'm curious if anyone's seen open source rise to, let's say, to the level where they are competing with a geopolitical player, with the power that they might be starting, that might be emerging behind these non-national entities. They're not entities. I don't have the language for this because it's just starting to emerge. But these networked groups, digitally native, who do seem to have some sort of power on a geopolitical level. Hey, we're back. Are any of them actually engaging in geopolitics, or is it still only nations?
Yeah, Jan?
Yeah, I think one of the important things here is that as much as it is useful to think of open technologies, commons-based governance as a different mode of collective action if you compare it to legal regimes or market-based regimes, I think the trap would be to completely separate this. And especially when you're talking about geopolitical tensions, I think you cannot think of geopolitical tensions being only the result of states that are rivaling. Because, for instance, the industry in the US is extremely good at playing this idea of a technological battle against China to attract more support, more funding that in different regions, but that in the end benefit the industry. So it's Jensen Huang, for instance, at NVIDIA that I think 2 weeks ago said, we are losing the AI race. Our only option is that we have China working on the NVIDIA chips forever, and this is how we will win this technological race. And I think to some extent, that's also what is happening in around open technologies, is that different players are indeed organizing outside of legal regimes, outside of market-based forms of coordination, but still because in the end they, for instance, want to make profits on the market, or because there are questions of power between regions and states. So it's not something you can separate clearly, and maybe that's why it's like this kind of boundary object that is hard to name, as you said, as an entity. It's like more, for me, like a different mode of coordination, an instrument that is mobilized by existing powers, be they companies or states, to influence others' actions, to get profit, etc. So I think that's kind of the difficulty of exactly putting the boundaries of that entity that you mentioned.
Yeah, thank you for an excellent question. There are a few different ways that we can conceptualize the dynamics between more grassroots, decentralized stakeholders and governments as those who are actually developing the regulations and policies within this space. One is that if you look at comparative consultation practices, like in my presentation, I talked about the process for developing the EU's CRA, for instance, and the fact that it now has mandatory consultation. It's not geopolitics per se that is saying that these actors need to engage. The geopolitics has motivated the regulation, and in turn the community wants to mobilize and minimize certain risks for what they do on an ongoing basis. But there's other ways that geopolitics might affect open source contributors and others within the ecosystem. One is if there's certain sanctions that are imposed, say your country no longer has access to a key repository, or people of a certain nationality are restricted from contributing to projects, then that will obviously have flow-on implications. Another way that individuals can try and engage is by having these more international regional partnerships, like grassroots mobilization, and we're seeing this already with the OSPOS network, with Open Source Congress. So the community sees that geopolitics is entering this space and saying, we're not going to just sit back and watch these regulatory islands pop up, we're going to be proactive and try and have those conversations.
Yeah, did we have any other questions? Yeah. I'm going to come over here.
Just one question. We talk about digital public things, and what is the role of open standards in this digital public initiative? We talk about open source. I know exactly what is open source, but about open standards, which is, I think, it's a key player in this business.
So we can talk about digital public goods and digital public infrastructure. Maybe, Ramya, did you want to talk a little bit around the intersection of DPI and standards?
Well, actually, I think first Marco should be answering this question, who's written precisely on this. Would you like to go first? Or? Okay. But yeah, certainly standards are a crucial component, especially open standards, if we understand them to mean participatively created standards, which foster new kinds of incentives for adhering to those standards, for instance, beyond just state-mandated adoption of a certain standard, or creating and gatekeeping a standard because it furthers certain monopoly initiatives. It's a crucial component to thinking about truly public, digital public infrastructures. But yeah, I mean, on the one hand, there is a question of the quality of participation in terms of who participates in standard setting initiatives and who doesn't. Standard setting organizations themselves as quasi-regulatory, for instance, and what kinds of accountability and democratic deliberation obligations should be attached to standard setting organizations. And on the other is what happens when there is no mutual respect for a standard. So in our paper, for instance, Andrew Renz describes a controversy around a document standard for structured data. There is a widely accepted standard for structured data, but in the early 2000s, Microsoft tried to advance its own standard for structured data, which would then create a dependency on Microsoft software for being able to analyze and work with structured data. And this lobbying effort succeeded. There now was a second standard for structured documents, but it's telling here to think, to use this as an example to try and think of strategies to not prevent forking of standards simply because it allows for the creation of a secondary proprietary market for software or hardware. for instance, but to think about strategies to actually cultivate respect for participatively created and accepted standards.
Okay. Anyone else want to come in? Or, okay, we'll take another question. Yes.
Hi. What I take from all these talks is there's a lot of really exciting projects happening and examples. And what I see in my work implementing is that there is corporate dominance. So there's a sort of gap here in what I'm seeing and here and what I'm seeing in my work in cybersecurity. In my view, the missing element is a global digital institution with systemic finance, less anarchistic governance, that actually just takes control of what is now privately owned by big tech. It just needs to actually control the digital infrastructure. I'm wondering if anybody sees the need for this kind of entity. Is there any thinking in this direction? Yeah, digital, more structured digital international governance. Is that something that you see happening, not only on a national level?
I'll try, yes. Excellent question. And like answering this with caveat that it's aspirational. And then I think I can only answer in like very small parts where I am observing and feeling inspired. So I think we all have seen many open source projects that's widely used. Often corporations, like they get funded, like VCs come in, and then it stops, and they change the license, right? Like, and then it stops being open source, or the terms and conditions differ. And I think we can name many that we depended like heavily on, like from Terraform to like Terraform to, God, I'm just like suddenly blanking, like MongoDB, like many things. And then we are almost always seeing the community fork version of it. And then that's sometimes when I get like inspired. And then sometimes these community fork versions do get supported by large corporations, like again, which is sometimes also like questioning why did this happen. And then sometimes we see large corporations systematically supporting certain like open source. So for example, Nick here support like OSI like supports clearly defined, which has contributions from like GitHub like people, and then who else was Microsoft. Yes, like many people. But then the project is like governed and like mainly steered by OSI. So that's that's like examples that I am inspired by, and I admit that this is no longer close to the global level international body, but from the grassroots level, I see inspirations.
Anyone else want to come in? Yeah, Jen.
Yes, thank you so much for a fantastic question. I'm going to start with talking about like vague developments at the UN, and then I'm going to transit to like more applicability within the open source context. So a key criticism that I have of the UN is until the last few years, they weren't really engaging with open source very much. That has obviously started to shift quite majorly. They've got the UN open source principles. They now have Open Source Week. And so there is this systematic analysis taking place of like how can the UN benefit from open source, but how can it encourage contribution to open source, including in realizing the Sustainable Development Goals. But in other areas which would presumably interact with your work, open source is still being siloed. And one instance is there's the UN Cybercrime Treaty, which was literally just adopted. It's going into force. But there was certain state interests in play that rather than focus, say, on cybersecurity, they wanted to focus on how can we control these structures that are being co-opted for surveillance. And basically, there were some states like Russia and China that wanted to have permissibility to still kind of do that more intrusive surveillance operation. So there weren't necessarily these considerations of open source. If you'll indulge the international lawyer, when it comes to international regional governance mechanisms, we've seen a shift partly because of the backlash against multilateralism and like the increased geopoliticization more broadly, including in the tech sphere, of moving away from traditional multilateral organizations like the UN towards more public-private governance mechanisms. And typically those are easier to set up, they can be more responsive. So if a body like the one that you're describing would come to be, I would anticipate it to be in one of those more informal structures rather than trying to mobilize states who now have very divergent starting positions to try and have that kind of organizational cooperation.
Great. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time for questions. I'm sorry. But I want you to all give a big round of applause to all of our panelists.